Nipigon. What comes to mind when we hear it? The bay, the river, hunting, fishing, logging, community, friendship. A diverse and thriving community situated at the top of Lake Superior in the vast wilds of northern Ontario. That all-encompassing word is the name of legend, famed the world over for its beauty, its wildness, its fish, renowned for its poetry that sings to us of the Nipigon, of the silence and the solitude and the power. Those who came here claim their memories for eternity when they return to the world beyond our shores. They came, they saw. They were conquered by the grandeur of our Nipigon, our river, our lake. Be proud of your Nipigon that you have today. Be aware of what you have that others don't. E. Millard, 1917. If we could journey back and see the days before remembrance, to a time when the Nipigon was overcome by the waters, would we then know what this place could mean? Time passed and the water levels decreased. From McCurdy Avenue, you stand on the terminal moraine, looking down on a glacial beach where early inhabitants created tools of copper. One could stand upon the shore of the Nipissing Beach 4,000 years ago and imagine what would become the Nipigon. The granite, the marble, the sandstone, and the red rock rising from the deep as islands ready for exploration. The river runs now just as it did in 1500 BC, yet with all its wild power, it has been tamed, flooded, and diverted over the last 100 years. About the same time as the voyagers made their way into the area, Jesuits came to Lake Nipigon. The Jesuits held services looking to make new converts of the native population found on these shores. Many natives who heard them singing ran away and hid, singing back at them from the bushline. The fur traders, adventurous groups from France and England, were eager to make a profit from the New World and marveled at the grandeur and vast untamed wilds of the Nipigon country. One can stand on the dock today and see what the fur traders saw so many years ago, as it was in the same location as ours today, only longer, and one could watch the full flow of the Nipigon River before the lagoon was created. The river would be bustling with activity from both native and French voyageurs paddling the river with their trade goods. Some would even stop at Red Rock's 5 Mile Point and clean themselves up for a night on the town. The only way to and from Nipigon in olden times was through the waterways, coming up the Nipigon Bay or the Nipigon River via canoe, York boat, barge, and steamship. Steamships could still be seen traveling into Nipigon Bay in old photographs until the railway was constructed. Eventually, railway became the preferred method of travel and shipping, as less and less steamships were seen entering the bay. In the railroad days, people often came to stay seasonally, with a small, courageous few choosing to battle the harsh elements of North Country living as permanent residents. As the railway came through, this meant that more people could make their stop at the already famous Nipigon and enjoy the benefits of the area as it had become Destination Nipigon. The Nipigon was chronicled the world over in poetry, legends, artistic works, and photography, and its name forged from the French, Lac de Nipigon. And by 1804, the natives called it Nipigon. In the 1870s, the name Nipigon was in general use, and finally by 1918, it was termed Nipigon. In the 1920s, one man came to Nipigon and chronicled its entire history and the area surrounding it. From the opening of buildings to the royal visit, the logging and pulpwood industry, the building of the Trans-Canada Highway, and the prisoner of war camp, to the daily life of the community. The man was Mr. E.C. Everett, photographer, entertainer, and entrepreneur. Everett had amassed a huge collection of photographs which are held today by the Nipigon Historical Museum. These photographs give us a glimpse into historical life on the 49th parallel and represent the capture of time impressed forever into photo paper. Far more than just a black and white image, they represent generations of knowledge, history, and story of the people that made Nipigon. It is with great thanks to people dedicated to the preservation of history, like E.C. Everett in the Nipigon Historical Museum, that we can see Nipigon as it was and as it now stands in the annals of history. We can see over 100 years of change in moments, see what was then and what isn't today. Some places you may recognize, others you won't. But in touring the town, one can imagine the people and places that made this picturesque community unique. And others can still find a small few who were actually there in those early days. The first permanent trading post in the area was established by Claude Greysolon d'Olhut in 1678 near the location of the present railway bridge. In those days, warlike fur trades were common between competing companies eager to prosper from the abundant wildlife found here. From Lake Nipigon down the river to the Nipigon Bay. You can find such posts as the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and the Revellon brothers, making a profit from the rich and diverse animal population of the Nipigon. Natives living in the area in the 1840s were still traveling by birch bark canoes and used dog teams in the winter, as this was the only way to get somewhere. By 1858, the Hudson's Bay Company had built a post called Red Rock Post, attempting to head off other traders from going upstream. In the early 1870s, Chief Trader Robert Crawford oversaw construction of a massive wharf along the river measuring 350 feet long by 52 feet wide, along with a farmhouse, stable, outbuildings, powder magazine, a men's warehouse, a trade store complex, boathouses, a warehouse, machine sheds, and a large 8-room officers' living quarters. This post became increasingly important as the cargo transshipment point, with goods shipped by steamboat to be distributed throughout the Lake Nipigon hinterland. In time, all of the Hudson's Bay Company buildings were sold off and eventually demolished. The field beside the Marina Bridge was made home to Don Clark's Great Lakes Shipping Office, and a tennis court was also visible. With the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885, trading and commerce began to shift from the river to the railway due to increased efficiency and cost-effectiveness. By 1898, the Hudson's Bay Company replaced the river post with a new store and warehouse near the CPR station. In 1924, a fire tore through the building and the manager's house. A new brick building was established on its foundation, being built from 1926 to 1927. The store was later known as the Bay, and in the late 1980s it became the Northern. After closing for a time, the building was revived once again and took on the name Fields. Today, the historic site on Front Street is occupied by the Bargain Shop. In 1871, some of the first names of Nipigon area residents could be found in recorded history through the census, such as Robert Crawford, Count Henry Delarond, John Watt, Francis Heron, Samuel Collin, William Wilson, James McCrae, James Marcella, Pierre Deschamps, the Carcajans, the Bouchards, and a host of other First Nation names ranging from Windigo to Katakalagard to Minnewanakawash. It is clear over 77 First Nation families made their home in Nipigon and surrounding area. as the Canadian Pacific Railway made its way around the Great Lake. A financial crisis had halted the completion of the line at Nipigon in late 1884. The Northwest Rebellion was raging. CPR General Manager William Van Horn assured Prime Minister John A. Macdonald that he can get troops from Kingston and Quebec within 10 days to Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan, if the funds to finish the railway were given. In reality, it would take months to construct a railway bridge over the Nipigon River. In the meantime, 3,000 soldiers had to slog through 10 miles of slushy ice across Nipigon Bay to Red Rock in April of 1885. Upon their return, a temporary trestle bridge made of white spruce pine poles was seen, and dwarfing them were the massive CPR stone towers. These stones, quarried from Verde Island, were put on a barge where they found permanence upon the Nipigon River. The bridge was rebuilt with heavier steel in 1923, and today the original stone pillars have been clad in reinforced concrete. With the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885, a small train station was set up. And in 1929, a much larger building was constructed on the east side of the tracks with fir beams all the way from British Columbia, hardwood floors and a gable roof. Nipigon was proud of this railway station.
My name is Gwen Nyman with Gwen Brown. I came to Nipigon in 1959. I arrived on Labor Day. And the reason I came here, I'll tell you how I came here. They had a little ad in the paper which had wanted teachers from Nipigon, Ontario. So I wrote and asked them for an application form, and they sent a telegram back giving me the job. They didn't even know me. So then I came on a boat over on the MS Italia, and it was all young immigrant people on the boat. So they said they come straight to Nipigon. I went to Toronto first, and with some people I've met, and I came with one other English girl who was in that report. I didn't know her, but she had been hired at the same time. So they were hiring English teachers. They couldn't get teachers to here, so they just hired anybody willy-nilly from England. Then I took a train from Toronto up this way, and there was trees on either side of the railroad track, and I thought it was just like Yorkshire behind the trees. That was just the border of these big cities and buildings all the way along. So I just knew that was just like a border. Like we have trees beside the railroad track, and then you got, I didn't know there was nothing there. That was a big shock. It was a horrible shock. I hated it. So I got here, and I got off the train, and there was nobody there to meet me, and it was like 10 or 11 at night, and I'm standing here on Main Street in the dark. And people in Toronto had told me they didn't know I was going to hear. They said it was all, and I'll tell you what they told me. They said it was 6 bars on the Main Street, and some people said everybody lives in teepees up here. So I had no idea what I was coming to, and that was only 59, not very long ago. Right. That's amazing.
Before the days of television and late-night bars, the people used to line up and wait for the passenger train to roar in the town. Despite the efforts of a local committee, the great CPR train station was demolished in October 1982. Eventually, a small station was erected but lacked any of the grandiose qualities of the former building. The Canadian Northern Railway System, later known as the Canadian National Railway, in order to cut costs, created a retaining wall and causeway by the Hudson's Bay Company Post and changed the course of the Nipigon River into what is now the lagoon. Work on this section was completed in 1914 and a station was built. The Transcontinental Railway became the CNR main line and turned north following the Nipigon River and up to Lake Nipigon. During World War I, 2 alleged spies were arrested carrying fuses, loaded revolvers, and code timetables in a plot to blow up railway bridges, including the bridge at Nipigon. The first independent store in Nipigon was built on the current location of the Nipigon Historical Museum by William and Georgina McCurdy in 1887. The store catered to the needs of local town people, railway, bushworkers, and gentlemen anglers who made their way to the area for the best brook trout fishing in the world. The building was so big, it stretched from the corner of 3rd Street almost to the alley. In 1938, Fred Sanderson bought the property, and in 1944, the southern piece was sold to Ava and Charles Schwazala, who ran a taxi stand for many years. Over the years, the southern section became Centra Gas, a pool hall and a restaurant. In 1949, Alfred Vivone owned the middle section of the lot, having bought a piece from both Thompson and Schwazala and built the Liberty Cafe. The cafe remained open until 1979 when Terry Winfield purchased the property and created a clothing and shoe store, which eventually became known as Doc's Menswear, located at 46 Front Street. Recently, the building has been home to a computer repair store, Mama G's Cafe, and is now home to the La Luna Cafe. Charles and Mary Thompson bought the northern portion, built a large building, and moved their drugstore from across the lane. There, Dr. A.H. Jeffrey made his practice in the basement. In 1957, Thompson severed a section of the lot and sold it to Alex Fraser, who opened up a radio and television repair shop. Today, it is home to the thrift store, which is owned and operated by local churches. Clarence and Gladys Saunders ran a grocery store since the 1960s.
In 1972, drugstore, Morris Thompson was the druggist, Morris Thompson. And there was the office was over by the window there, and there's a magazine rack down here, and the air ducts for the heat. And we believe that somebody was looking through the magazines, and they dropped a cigarette in the heat duct and caught fire. And in the middle of the night, it came down, and this brick wall, it's just a brick wall down here, and it was red hot. Very heavy here. All the can goes off the front and took all the good stuff.
Following the fire, the drugstore moved down the street beside the International Hotel, and Saunders bought the property and returned to full operation 2 years later. The grocery store closed in the 1990s. In 1904, a building was constructed on the corner of Newton and 2nd Street as an engineering office for the Canadian Northern Railroad. In 1905, Dr. Herman Bryan arrived to take care of the railway workers who took up residence there, and was the first doctor in town. Upon completion of the CNR in 1913, it was sold to a resident fur trader, Fred Sanderson. Carl Solander purchased it as a boarding house in the 1920s, and in 1942, Brompton Pulp and Paper Company acquired its Woods office in connection with the Red Rock paper mill. Ownership passed to St. Lawrence and Domtar Woodlands, who then moved into the town of Red Rock. Domtar generously sold the building and the grounds to the township of Nipigon for the sum of $1, with the provision that it be used as a museum for the preservation of the heritage of the Nipigon area. In June 1973, the Nipigon Historical Museum officially opened its doors to the public. On February 11, 1990, an early morning fire caused by a broken gas meter destroyed the museum. Thanks to the work of many volunteers, most of the artifacts were salvaged. In the year 2000, the township of Nipigon bought the Front Street building, and the Nipigon Historical Museum had a new home. Under the modern exterior of this home is the oldest log home still standing in Nipigon, built in 1887 on what would be 3rd Street. By 1925, the town's founding reeve William McCurdy and wife Georgina took possession of the home. Also worthy of mention, McCurdy patented a mosquito repellent called McCurdy's Repel Fly, a citronella-based repellent. In 1919, his son Jack accompanied Edward, the Prince of Wales, on the Royal Fishing Tour, while William outfitted them. In 1946, the Vivone family purchased the home and owned it for more than half a century, completely renovating it. In July 1915, a fly fisherman named Dr. John W. Cook came to Nipigon on a guided fishing tour of the river. The Fort William doctor managed to catch a world record brook trout on July 21st from the McDonald Rapids, also known as Rabbit Rapids, located by Virgin Falls. The monster fish weighed in at 14.5 pounds and measured a 31.5 inches. On August 9, 1915, the Fort William Daily Times Journal headline read, "Dr. Cook of Fort William officially named captor of the largest speckled trout known." A world record that remains unbroken. Many churches dot the town of Nipigon. And of these churches, the first to be built and hold service was in 1888 under the guidance of Anglican Reverend Robert Renison, who ministered at St. Mary's the Virgin from 1880 to 1894. Also worth noting that Reverend Robert Renison, whom one of our streets are named after, his oldest son, also named Robert, became the Bishop of Moosonee, and in later years became the Bishop of Toronto. The Reverend's wife and 6-year-old son Frank are buried in the small cemetery beside the rectory. The oldest stone in the cemetery dates from 1883, and the last recorded burial was in 1924. The cemetery also holds the bodies of 7 men who died in a tragic explosion around Auden on Monday, February 15, 1909, while constructing the Transcontinental Railway, and taken back by bobsled through 135 miles of ice and snow to Nipigon, and laid to rest in this cemetery. The men were killed while camping 15 feet into a rock. Nels Munson, foreman of the 9-man crew, accidentally struck a dynamite charge. When the debris was cleared, 4 men were found beneath and 3 mangled beyond recognition. 2 men survived the blast but could barely move an inch due to the fallen rock. It took 40 men 2 hours to dig the bodies out of the crater. The men killed were Nels Munson, foreman, Knut Lundquist, foreman's helper, Knut Nelson Bjornset, Anton Gustafsson, Magnus Andersson, Oscar Lundgren, and Oscar Sablom. The men were laid in coffins for their grim journey to Nipigon. The original crosses that marked the men's final resting place eventually began to degrade and were handed to the Nipigon Historical Museum for preservation by Reverend Doug McClure. A memorial service was held for these men by the St. Mary's Anglican Church on their Sunday, February 15, 2009 service. Prior to the construction of Renaissance Anglican Church, services were held at the home of Junior Chief Trader of the Hudson's Bay Company Red Rock Post, the 6'1" Irishman, Newton Flanagan, whom Newton Street is named after. The house, built in the French provincial style using a post and beam construction, believed to be built by Mr. Flanagan, may well be one of the oldest homes in Nipigon. Mr. Flanagan retired from service at the Hudson's Bay Company and moved to St. Paul, Minnesota in about 1892. The house changed hands many times over the years, with legal documents indicating transfer from the governor and the adventurers of England all the way through to the Shaftesbury clan in the year 2000, who planned to make restorations to its former grand character, and now occupied by Mr. Steve Gregorchuk. In 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway came through. Services were held in the waiting room of the original CPR station, then found on the west side of the tracks. The Hudson's Bay Company sold the property to the Diocese of Algoma, Church of England in 1908 for the sum of $2, so that a house could be built for the then Anglican minister, Benjamin Philip Fuller, who ministered from 1902 to 1909. As well as being used as a house for the clergy and their families, between 1930 and 1938, the house was leased out to the detachment and barracks for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Complete with hydroelectricity and heated with 3 wood stoves, the home was located on the intersection of Riverview and 2nd Street. A new rectory was built next to the original St. Mary's Anglican Church, and this property was sold as a private home in 1956, and still features some of the same charm while undergoing several improvements over the years, located at 14 2nd Street. Years later, the original St. Mary's Anglican Church was demolished. 14 years after the museum fire, in 2004, a new St. Mary's Anglican Church was built on the southeast corner of 2nd and Newton Street. Other notable historic churches in Nipigon include the picturesque Little Catholic Church built in 1906, which surprisingly holds about 70 people and has a 15-seat gallery. Originally located on the southwest corner of 2nd and Newton Street, a new, much larger church was built beside it in 1952, named the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Before Mac McCullough purchased the building, the bell tower was removed, and Mac rolled the building down 2nd Street to its current location beside the Anglican Cemetery, originally a clay tennis court. It became the Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Catholic Ukrainian. The church was renovated and the floor replaced as well, but the building still retains its original windows. The church is now the property of Mr. Ron Cheatham. The Nipigon Presbyterian Church was built in 1899. William McCurdy, whom McCurdy Avenue is named after, built the wooden pews, and his wife Georgina played the organ, taught Sunday school, and formed the Ladies' Aid. Between 1920 and 1923, the church also doubled as extra classrooms for the public school across the street. In 1925, it became known as the United Church. On Christmas Eve, 1946, while leaning away reading a posting on the bulletin board, second-year Reverend Don Tansley narrowly avoided death as he rang the bell. It suddenly came loose, falling 30 feet and crashed through the floor in front of him. He wished to go on with the Christmas Eve service, but was urged not to by Dr. Jeffrey after remolding his nose. Oddly enough, later that same year, the bell was struck by a bolt of lightning. The bell can be seen today hanging above the sign at Grace United Church on 5th Street. In 1965, the Hydroelectric Commission purchased the building for Nipigon Hydro, while several businesses also occupied it over the years, including the local paper, the North Shore Sentinel. It also was home to a herbalist shop and the local dentist. This church was found behind the site of the Nipigon Inn. Nipigon's first cemetery today is found beside the Ukrainian Catholic Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. However, in the early days, the only church nearby was Reverend Robert Renaissance Anglican St. Mary the Virgin, where he ministered from 1880 to 1894. The oldest stone in the cemetery is dated 1883, and the last recorded burial was in 1924. It is said the cemetery in the middle of town is full, but there only remains a handful of headstones to be seen, the majority of markers being wooden crosses, which have deteriorated with time, and unmarked graves. The names recorded on these headstones are as follows: Lucy Alice Cowie, August 11, 1895. Norman Matheson, April 23, 1901. Roderick M. Smith, June 5, 1902. Christy Smith, June 9, 1902. Alexander Matheson, Hudson Bay Company Factor, November 6, 1904. Mary Olson, March 27, 1905. Clarence A. McDonald, June 25, 1905. Mary McAdam, July 22, 1905. James Leslie McCurdy, January 14, 1906. John P. Hunt, September 26, 1908. Kathleen Hunt, September 10, 1909. Gertrude Alto, January 3, 1912. Margaret Irene Williams, September 6, 1918. Bertha and Gertrude Abrahamson, no date. L.A.C., undated. Nipigon's historical cemetery, then known as the Old CPR Cemetery, which was originally a wooded area where at least a dozen people were laid to rest in the early days of Nipigon. The only headstone found today reads Rupert Bergström, born in Bjurholms, Forsaming, Sweden, 31 March 1882 to 25 September 1913. St. Mary's Anglican Church records indicate interrals at this site, with many simply listed as a number followed by buried near CPR Bridge. Over the years, some of the small plot enclosures and fences have deteriorated. The abandoned cemetery was examined and all graves were marked off by chain fence enclosures, and the old CPR cemetery was renamed the Historical Cemetery and now has become home to many decorations found hanging in the trees. Cliffside Cemetery was originally a small cleared section of forest which overlooked the lagoon. The area was used for picnicking and featured a railing around the edges and a small gazebo. There was also a steep set of stairs you could follow down to the landing, where bands would play under a pagoda and dances were held. Eventually, the land was further cleared to make room for inevitable burials. These days, more people are opting for a cremation rather than traditional funeral viewings. This enables the families to bury loved ones with other family members who had previously passed on. In the early days, funeral services were held in the home, in what was called the parlor, which is where we get the word funeral parlor from. Over the years, changes to the way things are done caused the parlor found in each home to be called the living room, as opposed to a room meant for the dead. Funeral homes undertook embalming, viewing, cremation, and burial services. Don S. Cochran opened a small funeral home and ambulance service in December of 1960 and ran for many years, followed by Frank Lawrence. Peter Elliott finished his apprenticeship in Massey, Ontario, and came to Nipigon in September 1969, followed by his wife Linda in February 1970. Elliott Funeral Home is still in operation today. 1890 saw the construction of a large wood-frame rooming house called the Taylor House, located on Front Street. In 1939, it was rebranded as the Travelers and Tourist Home. Pete Preet bought the property in 1947 and oversaw the construction of the Normandy Hotel. On May 25, 1948, J.F. Cook opened its doors to the public. The hotel was designed by Port Arthur architect George Blanchard, complete with an oak entrance, brick and stucco exterior. It made quite an imposing presence on Front Street with its modernistic design. One can still remember buying hunting and fishing licenses from the establishment. In the 1980s, Jim and Joanne Train were awoken by a guest at about 2:45 a.m. by the smell of smoke coming from an overheated dimmer switch on the back wall of the lounge, which connected to the train's living quarters. Fire gutted the building and caused $100,000 in damages and took nearly 4 years to get the hotel back on its feet. In 1989, Gunther Hain took over as proprietor. The Normandy closed its doors in January 2007. Saturday, May 16, 2009, a fire broke out in a vacant building and destroyed 2 nearby homes. The cause was never learned. In 1893, a meeting was called between William McCurdy, Robert Renison, and Mr. Matheson, with the plan to organize the first school for all school-age children in the village. Lot 6, Block 1, a double lot on what would become 2nd Street, was purchased for $250 from the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into the Hudson's Bay Company. The village of Nipigon constructed a 1-room log schoolhouse, and in 1898, another room was added, followed by another in 1909. With the increase of school-age children in the area, trustees rented the Presbyterian Church because of the overflow in 1920. In 1923, all the children were moved to the new consolidated school, and the schoolhouse was demolished. In 1953, a new building was erected which replaced the old municipal office and jail on First Street. For a short time, the new building also housed the town's fire truck. The Nipigon Fire Department is now found atop the hill on the corner of 5th and Bell Street. After considerable negotiations for an appropriate site, In 1923, a building was erected on what would be 5th and Bell Street overlooking Nipigon, costing $35,000. By 1925, high school students were also in attendance, then known as the Consolidated and Continuation School. As the community expanded, in 1947, several new classes and a gymnasium was added to the massive structure. In 1955, a new building was completed in the town of Red Rock, located across the Nipigon Bay, called the Nipigon Red Rock District High School, and all 79 school students moved to the new building. At this time, the name was officially changed to the Nipigon Public School, while in 1977, the name was changed once more in recognition of the longtime contribution of teacher and principal, and became George O'Neill Public School. The Revlon Brothers Limited established one of the first stores in Nipigon in about 1900. The building was open to several others over the years, from Frank DeFazio to E.C. Everett to Fred Sanderson and John Zechner. It was also the location of the first Royal Bank, where deep within its walls one can still find a safe so large it has remained embedded there. In 1970, a fire destroyed Mikola's drugstore, which was located down the street. Within 6 months, he re-established a pharmacy in this building. Paul Folds took over the business in 1988, and in 2002, Rexall Drugs became the new owners. In the early 1900s, Nipigon pioneer Hjalmar John Sallow erected a pool room made of hand-constructed blocks on Front Street. Charles Thompson's original drugstore was housed here before moving across the lane. In the 1980s, it became home to Cassidy's Jewelers, followed by the Bake Shop, and now is home to the Edge Art Studio and Gallery. Several businesses were found in this block of buildings owned by a Mr. Pazook, such as Alex Frazier's Repair Shop, Flet's Video Store, Sam Chicatano's Barbershop, the Elite Cafe, The Bay, the Cow Palace, and Kelly's Clothing Store. Originally the Dewdrop Inn on one side and Atwell's Pool Room on the right, the Dewdrop Inn Cafe operated for many years and eventually was replaced by Sportsman's Steak and Burger. Today it is home to the China Gardens, serving Chinese and Canadian cuisine. Out of all the drinking establishments that were found on Front Street over the years, the China Gardens remains the only bar left. Years ago, drinking establishments were segregated, where men and women had their own separate side to a bar. A man could also accompany a woman into their side as an escort. The Tea Eaton Company also had a small catalog business attached to the building. Through the door on the right of the Dewdrop Inn was Atwell's Pool Room, found in the basement. And in the 1980s, the door was marked Trader John's Dining Room. Construction of the International Hotel began in the early 1900s under a Mr. Keenan, and by 1905, the International Hotel was pictured complete standing beside the Revlon Brothers building. The building burned down January 22, 1954. The Nash once again was enveloped in flames in 2009, resulting in the loss of yet another historical site. The landmark Nipigon Inn was a major player on Front Street for more years than anyone can remember. Built in 1906 by the Hogan family, whom Hogan Road is named after, the business proved lucrative. With a large transient population of railroad workers, the hotel business and tavern was always hopping. From the 1920s to 1943, the property had seen many renovations with the Hogan family as proprietors. On July 1, 1954, Frank Zayette took over. That date was a memorable one, as it was the day that Aboriginal people were first permitted to buy alcoholic beverages and drink them in licensed outlets. Nipigon's first curling rink was built in 1950 and many bonspiels were hosted. On February 11, 1955, the inn was filled with curlers, many from Port Arthur and Fort William for the men's bonspiel, when the furnace cracked open and a fire quickly destroyed the building at about 1 a.m. All patrons of the inn escaped without injury. A new Nipigon Inn was built by Orion O'Neill as proprietor in 1957 for several years, followed by the Lamberts, Robert Lesage, David Maynard, and Amelia Roy. Nick Razovich became the owner of the building in 2003. The building fell into disuse and was eventually demolished in December of 2011. In 1909, the township of Nipigon became incorporated, and the Northwest Company donated the property to the town for a jail. At the back of the building, one could still see the 10-inch thick walls made of stone and cement used to house those who broke the law. This little building also served as the police station, municipal building, and courthouse, and issued welfare checks and sold radio licenses. In 1953, the town office had moved to a new location on 2nd Street. Dr. Summerly renovated and expanded the building. He practiced medicine there for 30 years, and many townspeople still remember him. Upon his retirement, the building was converted to a preschool, and then a flower shop where high schoolers would get their corsages. Today, the building at 33 First Street is known as the Flying Post First Nation Indian Band, who represent the displaced peoples from the Timmins Groundhog River area with approximately 236 members, many living in the Nipigon area. Plans are set in place to construct a new Flying Post First Nation building on First Street, where the Maple Leaf Hotel was situated. Murray Ray is the Flying Post First Nation's current chief. A 3-story hotel and boarding house was built in 1909 by the Olsen brothers and named the Scandia House, which featured the Alku Cooperative Restaurant before it was moved to Railway Street. In the 1930s, men riding the rails and transient workers could count on filling their bellies before getting back on the train. The Scandia House was bought by Alan Gerlach, who removed the top 1.5 stories, converting it to a family home. He retained the original style of the hotel by keeping the 10-foot tongue-and-groove hardwood ceilings. The former public school principal, George O'Neill, and his wife Marion bought the home in 1946. Years later, it was owned by the Collins and the Delachucka family. The home operates today as a bed and breakfast by Tasha Sutton and James Anderson. Hudson's Bay officer and the legendary Count Henry de la Ronde, Count of St. Simon, had first lived on the Nipigon River at Parmachene. The fur trader, believed to have purchased the bell for St. Sylvester's Church, had bought a house built by a Port Arthur carpenter named Leach around 1910. Moving up the hill in 1927, the Dampier family bought and renovated the home, and in 1954 it changed hands again to Mac McCullough, who owned it until 1976. In about 1982, it became the home of the Rowley family, who still live there today. The home is found on the intersection of 1st and 2nd Street. The Hudson's Bay Company held the contract for the postal service in Nipigon until 1916. Alice Barker, formerly a Rossport schoolteacher, became the postmistress at this new site, keeping it open 6 days a week and meeting the mail trains that would come in twice every day. Miss C. Bliss owned the building and rented it to the post office for about $90 a year. Lance Grover became postmaster in 1934, and in the early hours of February 23, 1936, the office was robbed and his revolver and shells were taken along with $7.20. It is unknown whether the break-in was ever solved. A new post office was built on Front Street in 1938, and the house was bought by Lance and his wife Helen. Over the years, it also became Henry's confectionery, Les's cycle and sports shop, and Nerivia Outdoors. It has been the home of the Krasuski Hotchkiss family for more than 50 years. Elvin C. Everett came to Nipigon in about 1920, being an agent for Tip Top Tailors, with his wife, who delivered many babies in Nipigon, was a commercial photographer, and operated his first store in 1921, which was found on Front Street, called the House of Everett. The store sold everything from knickknacks to necessities and everything in between, including his photographs. The Everetts lived in a house behind the store. The House of Everett was a large building in the 1940s. The Olympia Cafe took up residence alongside. On March 1st, 1946, the store burned down. Everett's store then moved down the street and in later years moved to other locations around town. Mr. Everett was quite the entertainer, often known to use stilts and to be very clever and witty, and was quite the entrepreneur when opportunity would present itself. He was well known for his photography, and they say that absolutely no one was safe when he was out with his camera. Elvin, affectionately known as the Old Fossil, was featured on the CBC television show On the Road Again with Wayne Rostak, which aired November 27, 1984. Everett was also the recipient of the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal, commemorating the 25th anniversary of her ascension to the throne, awarded to organizations in very important fields of endeavor, including the professions, education and the arts, veterans groups, sports associations, philanthropic and charitable bodies, and welfare services. E.C. Everett passed away on Tuesday, May 22, 1984, at the age of 89, at the Nipigon District Memorial Hospital, and was predeceased by his wife Beatrice in 1968. In 1948, after Everett's store had been razed to the ground by fire, construction began on what would be the Plaza Theatre. The very first movie to play was the color film My Wild Irish Rose, starring Dennis Morgan and Arlene Dahl. Many would remember taking a date or going with the family to see a movie while the smell of buttery popcorn was adrift on the air when the doors of the ticket booth was open. In 1990, Don and Diane Martin bought the theater and kept it open until 2001, when it shut its doors for the last time. Today, the building is vacant with possible plans of converting it from a movie theater to a place to see theatrical plays. Only time will tell. In days gone by, the Nipigon Marina was the site of the Hudson's Bay Company, and scarcely remembered alongside of the river were the few wigwams which dotted the shoreline. In latter years, many small homes were located there. Among the families who lived in the mudflats were the Dampiers, the Blanchetts, the McDonalds, the Gagnons, the Chaboyers, the Ploufs, the Haggans, and Joe Delarond. For those who recalled living in the mudflats in the early days, it is hardly recognizable today, and one could scarcely imagine where the homes even were. As for the river, it had been dredged so many times to deepen and divert it, it has literally been changed beyond recognition. As we travel further down the river, a man named Colonel Little ran the small mill which started up in 1921 and aptly named the Little Mill. It was at the end of Mill Road, across the CN tracks where the walking trail is. The Little Mill depended on the power generated from the newly constructed Cameron Falls Generating Station. 15,000 cords of spruce a year were taken into this little mill and turned out baled pulp.
Yeah, the Little Mill was down way past the plywood mill, and you had to cross the track. Yeah, and they used to haul all the bark with one horse and one little buggy with two wheels, and it used to dump. We used to go down there as kids and ride with the guy that hauled the bark.
In the olden days, the timber industry was booming. Railway workers were settling on homesteads in the area and becoming woodcutters. Bushmen would cut on Lake Nipigon and drive the logs down the Nipigon River and the Black Sturgeon River out to mills for processing. It took nerves of steel to drive the logs, as one could easily be pinned and crushed in the water, between logs or between large rocks on the river. In some cases, dynamite had to be used to free up log jams. It was also quite common to see log booms used to enclose the logs by the mill as tugboats pulled the booms to the large conveyors. The river drive ceased in 1973. The little mill ran intermittently and was demolished in the mid-1960s. Further down the river, at what is called Sawmill Point, two other mills also operated, one by Mr. Don Clark. Both sawmills made ties and slab wood for boxcar doors. Another mill opened in 1957 and began producing plywood under the name Northern Plywood Limited on Park Road. The mill changed hands several times over the years, and finally in January 2007, it became Multiply Forest Products, which manufactured flooring underlay. The mill employed about 130 people and was the #1 employer in town. Sadly, on February 7, 2007, the town was dealt a devastating blow as a fire started by a lathe and quickly burned out of control. Employees escaped without injury, but the town was soon drained of its reservoir as for the next 2 days, many explosions were heard, even across the bay, and one could see the fire from Red Rock. By February 9th, the 50-year-old mill was no more. An empty field is all there is left today, used by local log trucks for parking. The building next to the Plaza Theater, which today is occupied by two businesses, Classicut Hair Design and the Nipigon General Store. On the left partition was a sewing and fabric shop, and in the mid-1980s was Gertrude's Flower Center. The right side was home to Restaurant LeBlanc, and in the 1980s became Cassidy's Jewelers. The empty lot next door was once home to Lespi's Bakery, and then became the site of the Bank of Nova Scotia for a short time. And then Nipigon's first Canadian Tire store was found here in 1964. The store eventually had burned down, yet Canadian Tire, a major necessity to the town, is now found on the intersection of 1st and 5th Street. The large building found at 16 Front Street was built by the Bolins and became a home for various businesses. Today, this brick building is home to Superior Counseling programs. Directly facing the tracks on Front and 5th Street, Miss Boleyn operated a clothing store out of this building in the 1980s, while the other side hosted many businesses over the years, including a bowling alley found in the basement, a video store, and today is the location of Yes Employment Services. On the right-hand side of what was Boleyn's clothing store is a small property, which in 1969 was a craft store operated by Miss Cody. Over the years, it became JD Beauty Salon, and more recently is home to Studio 155. To the left of Boleyn's is a private home built in the 1950s, which was once Arvo Payu's office, and then Pankovich's shoe repair. The building was also used more recently as Ovid's tax office. Just next to this building is found a private home turned into a fine photography and portrait studio, print business, and art gallery owned by Art LaFramboise, cleverly named Art by Art. In the early 1920s, another hotel was erected on Front Street named the Ovilio Hotel, originally run by Dominic and Maria Gentile. Built in 1926, it was first started with the construction of living quarters, and then added a beverage room, and in 1937, a pool hall and ice cream parlor were added. In those days, rooms were rented out for $1 to $1.50 a night, and the beer was 10 cents a glass and 21 cents a bottle. Bushworkers and traveling salesmen frequented this establishment. In the early morning hours, they could head out and easily catch the train. As of August 1980, the Ovilio, one of the longest-running family businesses in northwestern Ontario, closed its doors. The building was demolished on Thursday, October 12, 1995, which made room for the Township of Nipigon's municipal office and public library, which opened their doors in 2009. Along with the new building, the paddle to the sea park was constructed, complete with a grand waterfall. To the right of the McCurdy Vavone House was an unassuming brown brick building which began its life as a Chinese restaurant and eventually shut down and became Nipigon's first telephone exchange. The building also became home to the Nipigon Public Library for many, many years. And with the opening of the new municipal office, the library moved across the street to its current location. The building was recently demolished. Nipigon has had its share of taxi services over the years, owned by various people and situated all over town. By the Nipigon Cafe, there was Mackie Taxi, and Arnold Kosh ran Bell Taxi. There were two by the liquor store on 3rd Street. The main one was located on the corner of 3rd and Front Street. Crescent Taxi was owned by the Schwazelas, which eventually was located by the China Gardens. The Willans owned Pine Taxi, and yet another taxi owned by a Finn man was called My Taxi, while Arvo Ranta competed with Your Taxi. At its height, there were 39 taxi cabs in Nipigon. The first building in this section of town was a large white building, which was the community hall built by Arvo Payu. This was a lively meeting place in the early days. The hall was also known as the Palace Theater, the place to watch silent films and listen to the piano, while weekends were jumping with dances. Even residents from Red Rock were known to walk the tracks for a night out. The Palace Theater, also known as the White House, eventually became Salonin's Cafe in the 1930s. In time, it became Bouvier Motors, selling Ford and Mercury vehicles from this site. These days, 143 Railway Street is home to Kinson Millwork Incorporated, specializing in making fine furniture and custom millwork. One could also marvel at the mural painted by Dan Sawatsky in 1993 of the Canadian Pacific Railway and train as it passes through town. Father and son, Dan and Peter, were also commissioned by the Business Improvement Association to paint the other murals which are found at the Nipigon Legion depicting the river drives, and by Zechner's Food Market depicting Florian Zechner in his delivery truck outside of his store. The first service garage in town was built by Arvo Payu in 1925 and found on the intersection of Railway and 5th Street. It was located in the parking lot section in front of the Nipigon Legion. The garage became the Imperial Esso service station and the General Motors dealership, while in the 1930s Charles and Frank Gerlach bought the business. In the winter of 1937, record snowfall amounts caved in the roof of the garage, and Arvo rebuilt it for the Gerlachs. It stayed in their family for the next 40 years, and with their younger brother Henry, Hank, taking over in 1952. Over the years, it has housed the Nipigon Red Rock Gazette, a thrift store, a pool hall, and a pop shop. John Zechner bought the property in 1981 and expanded the grocery store in 1987, where the garage was demolished, creating an even larger parking lot as Zechner's Tomboy. Zechner's Food Market is still in operation today. Originally found on the north end of Front Street beside the Taylor House, Nick Sallow ran a butcher shop and grocery store, where one could also purchase gasoline and other products. In the 1920s, this brick building also became home to the first co-op store in town, as the price of food and clothing was on the rise, and Nipigon residents formed the Consumers Co-op store. For the sum of $5, an individual can buy one share in the co-op. Eventually, the store was moved across the tracks to Railway Street, opening its doors in 1926 and ran for the next 25 years. In 1959, the Zechners bought the co-op building for their business, Marshall Wells Hardware. Other stores at that location have sold furniture, crafts, and baked goods. In 2002, a resource center for families and a jewelry store occupied the location, while today it is home to the Children's Aid Society and the Nipigon Red Rock Gazette. Attached to the back of the co-op was the Nipigon Bottling Works, built in 1912, where Tom Larilla and his son Toivo later ran the bottling business from 1923 to 1969. In 1941, the company reported 3,800 cases of pop produced. Upon occasion, these bottles can be found in the area and are sought by local bottle collectors. In the 1920s, a Swedish man named Erik Larsson came to Nipigon and built a house and established a Maple Leaf ski factory on the site. Before coming to Canada, he learned how to make downhill ski jump skis from sawn birch logs and were sent by rail to the mines. Mr. Larsson was instrumental in starting the ski hill on the east side of the river in 1938. In 1946, an early morning fire began in the lumber pile next door and quickly enveloped the factory and the home. The basement was left intact. Rather than rebuild, he gave it to the Red Cross Society, who put up a structure to hold meetings. In 1955, the building was also used for worship by the Emmanuel Lutheran Church congregation, until a new church was built up on 5th Street. The Nipigon Baptist Church also used the building from 1967 to 1972. When a new, larger church was built, the Harbinson family bought the property and converted it back into a home. By 1920, a road had been established from Port Arthur, Fort William, now Thunder Bay, to Nipigon and extended up the Settlers Road to Cameron Falls. Eventually, the highway was shifted into the town of Nipigon, and a bridge needed to be constructed to connect east and west, thus creating what we now call the Trans-Canada Highway. Back then, it was called the King's Highway, but most people often called it by the name of the town it went to. For example, Port Arthur to Nipigon, the Nipigon Highway, or the Port Arthur Highway. In those days, the Trans-Canada Highway was far from finished, and the northbound Hearst-Toronto Highway would not connect at Nipigon until around 1945. Until that point, it was the only way to Toronto before the southerly route was created. In 1963, the highway was finally completed with a dedication ceremony and christened the Trans-Canada Highway. Yet persistent drivers did actually slog their way through construction zones to their destinations. As for the bridge, this was a monumental task. In shortest possible terms, Rainer Construction began the job hammering the steel cofferdams into the riverbed by steam-powered pile drivers, and concrete piers were put in place. The bridge stands 100 feet above the Nipigon River and spans 827 feet across the gorge, and was completed in the fall of 1937 with a ribbon-cutting ceremony on September 24th, officially connecting the highway. In 1941, the highway from Nipigon to Port Arthur was finally paved. Also worthy of note, the Veterans Guard was put on duty to protect the Nipigon River Bridge from possible attack from hostiles during World War II, following the foiled plot to destroy Nipigon's railway bridge in the First World War. Guards were also found at Virgin Falls protecting the dams. In 1974, reconstruction took place on the bridge. A new suspension bridge, the first of its kind in Ontario, at a cost of $106 million and designed by Marshall Macklin Monahan, was being planned. Construction of the first two-lane bridge westbound began in July 2013 by Bott Construction and Ferrovial Egremont. The 246-foot high bridge was completed and opened on November 29, 2015. Priestley Demolition Incorporated was tasked with dismantling the old bridge to make room for the second identical two-lane bridge. With only one two-lane bridge completed, on January 10, 2016, freezing conditions and heavy winds caused improperly tightened bolts holding the shoe plates to shear off as the cables pulled the bridge up by 60 centimeters, grinding travel to a halt. The next morning, a single lane was opened to ease congestion. A quick fix was made by pouring thousands of kilograms of concrete to pull the structure back down. On February 25, 2016, both lanes were open for opposing traffic once again. The eastbound set of lanes and cables stabilized the bridge as designed and was completed at the end of November 2018. Along with the bridge construction, the township also erected a 40-foot tall lookout tower in the same style as the newly completed Nipigon River Bridge and features an exhilarating 360-degree view. Today, improvements to this area are still being made. In the 1930s, after construction finished of the Trans-Canada Highway, the highway went right through town, following the tracks along what is called Railway Street. Alongside of the highway was a popular restaurant called the Nipigon Cafe, constructed of brick in the classic art moderne. The original proprietors were Sandy and Lily Kurakowski, who changed the business from a garage to a restaurant. A tunnel linked the cafe to the house next door where the owners lived. The Kurakowski family owned the restaurant until 1972, when John and Georgina Stravopoulos took over. Today, the original sign is gone and is found at the Nipigon Historical Museum, as the business is being renovated as of summer 2019. Also worth mentioning was the public sauna and taxi stand that was next door. Situated by the 5-point intersection was Clark Motors in the 1950s, selling Chevrolet and Oldsmobiles, followed by Riverside Motors. Competition was found up the hill in the form of Bouvier Motors, which sold Ford and Mercury vehicles. In time, the building was host to many businesses such as Let's Rent a Video, the Nipigon Red Rock Gazette, Subway, and Max. Today, this building is being renovated. Upon John Sallow's retirement in 1930, he graciously donated his farmland to the future Red Cross development of the Nipigon Memorial Hospital. The Red Cross raised enough money from their drives for the construction of the hospital in 1948. John Sallow received the dedication plaque which stands at the cenotaph found between 5th and 6th Street on November 11, 1975. Construction of the site was completed in 1949. In 1956, the hospital became incorporated. As time went on, a northwest branch was added, complete with an emergency room and nursery, while on the farthest end of the building, older residents would live on a permanent basis. In January 1993, the Nipigon District Memorial Hospital opened its doors on a brand new site, found between the top of 1st Street and Hogan Road, on Dr. Jackson Hughes Drive, featuring the Jackson Hughes Medical Center, the Nipigon Ambulance Center, and an on-site helipad. Located on the corner of Railway and Bell is the House with the Flowers. This was originally the home of Mr. Ranta, who opened it as a boarding house. Tragedy struck on February 11, 1961, when one man was shot dead in the basement, and the other committed suicide immediately following. The house was eventually purchased by the witty Reynard Abrahamson, who has taken great care of the property and is well known for a stunning garden beside the four-way stop. The first cenotaph in Nipigon was originally found by the train station on the south side. Eventually, it was moved centrally between 5th, 6th, and Railway Street. Lawrence and Ruby Martin, an elderly couple from the prairies, originally had a home here, and also it ran as a boarding house for laborers. Eventually, the boarding house was removed and replaced by the Nipigon Legion Branch No. 32's cenotaph for Remembrance Day ceremonies. Annually, on November 11th at 11 a.m., war veterans and civilians would assemble here and stand in remembrance of those who fought and gave their blood for the continuance of freedom. In latter years, the cenotaph needed an upgrade, and the Nipigon Legion held fundraisers, raising enough money to construct a new cenotaph on the site, and was completed in 2018. Count Henry Delaronde, HBC officer. William McCurdy, 1st Reeve. Robert Renison Jr., Bishop of Toronto. Al Hackner, World Curling Champion 1982 and 1985. Erwin Nickel, Hockey Hall of Fame inductee 2006. E.C. Everett, photographer, poet, and entrepreneur. Jory Zechner, television and singer. Dee McCulley, television and filmmaker. Cheyenne Havorka, singer and songwriter. Richard Harvey, mayor and accomplished scuba diver. E.C. Everett once wrote, "Drive the nail straight, boys, hit it on the head. Strike with all your might, boys, while the iron is red. When you've work to do, boys, do it with a will. They who reach the top, boys, first must climb the hill. Though you stumble off, boys, never be downcast. Try and try again, boys, you'll succeed at last. What do these words mean to you? Maybe a railroad poem, maybe a poem for the downtrodden, maybe a poem of hope that no matter what happens, there will be other chances and success can be achieved. Nipigon was struck while the iron was red, forged in history upon the strength of the fur traders, the bushworkers, the railwaymen, the entrepreneurs, the bold and the young at heart. Nipigon called as one in the wilderness, and many came to answer. The Nipigon has always been an attraction, famed for its fishing, beckoning multitudes of anglers and hunters from all over the world, from the many historic sites and the royal visits. A drive through Nipigon brings many sugared thoughts of yesteryear, from its snowy Christmases to its many popular summer events. It is no wonder so many have come to this community and chose to stay. The warmth and friendship is what makes this a community, the sort of place where you can walk down the street and feel safe, to raise a family and enjoy the company of others at social functions. If home is where the heart is, the heart of Canada truly lies upon the bank of the Nipigon River, where many over the years have come to spend their lives, within the glorious landscapes and majestic sunrises, and the closeness that only small town smiles can provide, like the hug of a warm blanket. This is home, and it calls to you, that you may experience Nipigon the way we have. Perhaps the next time you're traveling the Trans-Canada Highway, you will make the turnoff and find all you seek and more in what we call Destination Nipigon.